Welcome to the SOLA Network. My name is Moses, and I serve on the SOLA editorial team. Today, I have the great privilege to introduce you to today's guests. Neither of them are new to the SOLA podcast, but just in case there are any newcomers out there, first we have Dr. Alex John. He's a professor of higher education at Azusa Pacific University and also serves as the coordinator of Cali, the Korean American Leadership Initiative, which is a ministry of the PCA. He's also a ruling elder at New Life Presbyterian Church in Orange County. And finally, he's served as the moderator of the 45th General Assembly of the PCA in 2017. Second, we have Pastor Thabiti Anyabwile. He's the lead pastor at Anacostia River Church in Southeast Washington, D.C. He's the author of several books, including The Gospel for Muslims, The Decline of African American Theology, and The Faithful Preacher. Most recently, he helped launch the Crete Network, a ministry dedicated to planting churches in Black and Brown communities, and serves as the board president. Now, today's conversation was initially inspired by the launch of the Crete Network, which started a conversation amongst Asian American pastors over at the Off the Pulpit podcast that eventually evolved into a SOLA article and now this conversation. And so both of you brothers have been invited to sit at the table at the highest level with prominent multi-ethnic national organizations. And many minorities would say, you've made it, you're on the varsity team of ministry. But instead of continuing to charge forward within the multi-ethnic ministry spaces, you both, as well as many other Black, Brown, and Asian American leaders, are choosing to focus instead on ethnic-specific ministries, what many would considered to be the junior varsity of ministry. So Thabiti, since the Crete Network was the most recent catalyst for this conversation, would you mind sharing with us why you see the need for a ministry that focuses on distressed and neglected Black and Brown communities?
Well, first, it's a joy to be with you guys again to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing where the Spirit of the Lord takes us. Let me say a couple of very quick things in response to that. The Crete Collective exists because actually we're talking about neighborhoods that are not being evangelized, where contextualized apologetics are not being developed, where new church works are, if they're happening at all, are happening adjacent to these neighborhoods. And so I think there's an implicit critique that with all of the wonderful work that's happening with church planting, and we don't wish any of it to be diminished, that they are sizable neighborhoods and communities made up predominantly of Black, brown, and yellow people in distressed neighborhoods that get almost zero investment and attention, right? And so we exist because we think there's a gap there. We think there's a hole there. Secondly, we exist because we also think that there are things that need to happen in the course of disciple making and teaching, theological reflection that is not happening in so-called multi-ethnic spaces. And in fact, to which there are significant barriers to those conversations happening in those spaces. So where does an African-American or an Asian American traumatized by maybe some racist encounters that they have had, maybe repeated encounters, where do they go to process that? Where do they go to get faithful biblical shepherding that takes seriously their sort of embodied selves and the experience of that embodiment in a world that's sort of hostile to that embodiment? Where do they go for repair? Where do they go to be bound up, to be cared for? Where do they go to be helped to think constructively, not only about their Christian identity, but also about their ethnic identity, which at least according to Acts 17 and other places is not a mistake. It's by the providential design of God. Where do they go to get both affirming and critical perspective on their cultural selves? It's not in multi-ethnic spaces. In fact, part of I just want to challenge the notion that multi-ethnic spaces are the varsity. They're not. There are places where often there are a lot of resources and a lot of attention, but it's not the varsity of ministry. It is, in fact, the elementary school of ministry insofar as it actively seeks to avoid these difficult conversations. And almost all the spaces that we could name that people think of as the 800-pound gorillas of multi-ethnic ministry are places that actually actively avoid these conversations in any constructive way beyond just saying, hey, we're all Christians. And so I think that's entirely inadequate. A ministry response, a gospel response, is an entirely inadequate response for people who believe that the scripture is sufficient for helping us to live and as Christians in the context of our actually embodied lives. And so I'll stop there. I feel like I said too much already. I'll stop there.
Goodness.
Wow, that's very helpful. Thank you. And Alex, I guess from your side, in what ways do you believe Asian American ministries should follow the lead of the Black church? And in what ways do you think the Asian American situation is different? And maybe even adding to the question, where do ministries like Cali fit into that?
Yeah. Great. To be honest, I'd rather just hear Thabiti talk all day. So this was good. I really appreciate what you had to say. Absolutely difference in experience. Years ago, a scholar, John Ogbu, talked about voluntary versus involuntary migration. The histories are different for Asian Americans within Asian American context, as well as how Asian American sort of history is different from Black history in the United States. But we have to think of immigration, voluntary immigration, if you will, for Asian Americans, and that's a long history. Chinese American history is fundamentally different from Taiwanese or Korean American immigration patterns. But since I'm in a Korean church, part of the challenge is the short history of immigration in the United States. And you can read about the scholars who have talked about the short history, the modern history, if you will, from mid-1960s, how immigrants from South Korea were allowed, initially not, but allowed to come to the United States as an ancillary conversation. It was a result of civil rights movement that happened from our Black brothers and sisters who really pushed for civil rights that Asian Americans were a beneficiary of in the mid-1960s. But what we have is a relatively short history, and you've got language as well as culture embedded in this post-immigrant experience. And so if you're Korean American listening to this and watching this podcast, you know that many of our experiences in church were tied to Korean ministry, Korean language and culture. And oftentimes our worship was embedded and tied to language and culture that we're trying to break free of. This is not new in terms of ethnic-specific churches in the United States. I think the Dutch went through this several hundred years ago, as did other groups, the Germans, et cetera. One of the differences is that over time, the Dutch church became more Americanized. They looked more American in many ways, where Asian Americans continue to struggle with this idea of the perpetual foreigner. So you could be fourth generation Chinese American and Christian and still be considered a foreigner. And we've seen this time and again. So those are two different contexts, I think, why Asian American churches or Pan-Asian churches exist, where it's still a language in English, but the culture, as Thabiti pointed to so eloquently, the culture is still also being addressed. And that is not a mistake, because we are made in God's image. And we should take the totality of both our Christian identity and our ethnic identity, perhaps in that order, but we're still recognizing our ethnic identity. And in many ways, in a worldly sense, a lot of minorities are still sojourners in this world, where we are constantly reminded where we don't belong. So there is a place, absolutely, to be able to speak freely and openly about some of the challenges that are going around in the world as it pertains to ethnic-related racism, and of course, solid biblical Christ-centered preaching and teaching and fellowship.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And where do you think that ministries like Cali fit into that?
Yeah, Cali exists primarily to address the issues of Korean American English-speaking pastors who came out of a Korean church, a KM context, and very quickly discovered either they've got to learn Korean very quickly and do Korean ministry, or you've seen a lot of people make this leap into what they thought was varsity and go into a multi-ethnic church or a white church. But even on our own ideology, we said, well, that's the regular church. Even Korean American pastors would say that. I don't think I've made it until I can go into a white church, until I can minister to white people and be respected by them. But I can't be in a Korean American church. But there are still plenty of, because that's the transition, it's only been 40, 50 years, of ethnic Koreans who speak English, who are doing ministry in English-speaking contexts inside of a Korean church. So it's going to take time. If we had as much time as perhaps the Dutch or the Germans, right, we're talking a couple hundred years, right? We're only talking 40, 50 years for Koreans. And so I know some people are very anxious to see this move forward and for us to evolve. But the reality is there's a ministry niche that we need to address. And oftentimes leaders who are Korean Americans working in these spaces feel unsupported. And so Cali exists to provide this type of space, ministering to them in their very unique cultural contexts.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And just in response to what both of you guys have shared, Martin Luther King has been attributed to saying 11 a.m. Sunday is our most segregated hour. So what does that quote mean to both of you guys?
Well, I think he's right. I think that not only is it still one of the most segregated hours, but actually 11 a.m. on Sunday is nowadays the best opportunity for a more integrated experience. And the fact that it remains segregated is telling us something about the self-selection that's going on in people's lives. It's also telling us something about the cultural thickness, if you will, that exists in most of our churches, that makes it hard for the sort of ethnic other to sort of integrate, penetrate, be healthy, be themselves, be welcomed and accepted. And this is not the same thing as saying there's open hostility. I mean, when Dr. King said that in the 1960s, we're talking about a very different social context, right? Where to be an African-American and go into a white church could literally get you killed. Where actually remaining in your own church across town in a Black congregation might find you inside of a church that's being bombed or burned. And so that's a very different social context, and we praise God for the progress that's been made. But there is still a kind of selection that's happening that continues the segregation. And here's what I want to say to folks who maybe are listening and thinking that sort of selecting, that opting toward more ethnic specific context is going backwards, is moving contrary to the sort of civil rights ethos that we often imagine when we hear a quote like that from a Dr. King. Here's what I want to say, is that being in ethnic specific context is not only permissible, it's actually quite necessary for a lot of Christians, again, to receive the sort of comfort that and discipleship that's needed. Because in these spaces that still remain largely segregated, you still encounter the shibboleths, the cultural shibboleths that guard the gate as to who's acceptable and who's an outsider. You still deal with the microaggression sometimes, and sometimes the outright aggression. You still deal with a kind of, and we saw the worst forms of it last week, didn't we? You still deal with a kind of civic religion that's kind of God and country religion, which in many cases is sort of anti the concerns of your own ethnic community. And so those are not friendly spaces. And so it becomes necessary to have places where we opt to be with people who accept us in Christ and worship with us in Christ. Here's the other reason it's necessary, and I'll stop here. Let's just do a thought experiment real quickly. What if we imagine that all the evangelism that had to happen in predominantly Black and brown and yellow neighborhoods had to happen through the agency of white evangelical churches? How many Black and brown and yellow people would come to Christ, would be brought into contact with the gospel, right? I'm going to argue that particularly if you take out something like radio ministries or television ministries, and you talk about just sort of personal evangelism, crossing the street to talk to your neighbor, I'm going to argue that the vast majority of Black, brown, and yellow folks who don't know the Lord, who live in predominantly Black, brown, and yellow neighborhoods, especially if they're poor neighborhoods, are not going to come in within earshot of the gospel. So our sort of having a missional concern, the way Paul did, longing for his kinsmen according to the flesh to come to know Christ, is a godly, biblical, missional concern that's really quite necessary if we want to see our families and our neighborhoods evangelized. Because given the way we are self-segregating, which is happening not just ecclesiologically in terms of membership in churches, but it's happening missiologically in terms of who we go to with the gospel. If we just sort of ride that wave, we'll be riding that wave away from our people, taking the gospel with us. And that is not a win for Team Jesus. We should not coast that way.
So good. So good. I could add just a little bit to this. Absolutely spot on analysis. As an equity scholar, you have to understand the context, as Thabiti was alluding to, is segregation as a term. It was a legal mandate to say that you were not allowed, and this is the time of the 60s when Dr. King was saying this, is that white churches would not have fellowship. And the Black church existed because the white church wouldn't extend fellowship to Black Christians. And so that's the context. What we're talking about today is you're not robbed of the choice. And I think that's a distinction, I would say, a distinction between segregation and separation. An important distinction, because you're not robbed of the choice of being able to go to ethnic-specific ministries, multi-ethnic ministries, predominantly white ministries. That's okay too, but we need to recognize that's what it is. And just building on this idea that Thabiti was talking about, I've seen the results of oftentimes what happens through colonialized mission work. I mean, well-intended they may be, but the impact of this is that we have a westernized version of Christianity, even among Asian Americans. And so you see this, the problem that emerges is even the icons of a white Jesus is displayed in Asian churches and in Asia. Right? How did that happen? I mean, it's a violation of one of the most fundamental commandments, that we don't make God in our image. And that's exactly what's happened in the West. And we've embraced it without much criticality. And you see a generation of Asian Americans and Black and brown Christians as well, perhaps, who haven't really thought about this. And it's coming to it's becoming an issue increasingly for us to really rethink how dominant ideology and culture has impacted our faith. It's syncretized American Christianity or Western Christianity that I think is important for us to address. And one personal note is how I came to faith was through a Korean campus mission in college. I got saved when I was a first year in college, and it was a group of Korean Americans who reached out to other Korean Americans and shared the gospel with me. And it was interesting because I didn't have to detach my ethnic identity and culture from this conversation. And every time I brought up an issue about immigration or assimilation, it was understood, and I got just the gospel. Whereas I remember talking earlier with some of my white brothers and sisters in the Lord, and I would bring up issues of racism, and they would come from their lens and say, well, you know, I don't see color. Well, that's really difficult for a young Christian, Asian, Korean American Christian to reconcile. And they were speaking with all authority as a Christian, but didn't recognize their own whiteness as they were saying that, right? Their own limited ability to recognize what was going on in the world. And they simply conflated their whiteness and their Americanness with their Christianity, which is unbiblical. So I think it's important to have this space where we have people who look like you and might think like you, but fundamentally different because we're able to share the gospel and share eternal truths. So Amen. Again, a reminder why these types of spaces are necessary.
Amen. Amen. So well said.
Wow. Well, we'll keep going. Thabiti, this is a question for you. Are there things ethnic-specific churches and ministries can do in service to the gospel, apologetics, and discipleship that maybe multi-ethnic churches can't do as well?
Yeah. Well, I think my brother was putting his hands on some of the things already. Right. It's counterintuitive for many people. But what he just said about the fact that in an ethnic specific context, we can often have so many things in common that it frees you to focus on the gospel and to evangelize in that context. I think that's spot on. If I don't have to argue with you about my priors in terms of the reality of racism or what have you, I can just get to Jesus just much more effectively and quickly than in the multi-ethnic context where my priors or your priors may not be taken for granted, and we find ourselves arguing about those things rather than, focusing on the Lord and the necessity of faith in the Lord. The other thing that I think is enabled in sort of ethnic specific context that perhaps is more effectively done than multi-ethnic context is that we actually get to do a more thorough and a more widespread sort of leadership development in these contexts, right? So there are people who look to us like leaders in our context who are never recognized as leaders in a multi-ethnic context. So one of the things that I'm constantly having pastors ask me is, we want to be more diverse. We want a more diverse leadership. How do we improve the diversity? How do we find folks who are leaders? And I say, well, I kind of know this guy. Have you thought about this guy? Yeah, no, but he doesn't fit this or doesn't do this, da, da, da. But if I put him over in a predominantly African-American context, I mean, he's Paul or Peter, right? And so the lenses that we wear, even when we're thinking about leadership and who we invest in terms of leadership, they're really different in a sort of ethnic specific context versus a multi-ethnic context. Here's a third thing I think can be an advantage to ethnic specific context. There are apologetic issues that we deal with in inner city Washington, D.C. that aren't sort of the apologetic issues of Iowa or Southern California even, right? So I go downtown by the stadium, and on most nights when there's a game, there's a gaggle of 30 Black Hebrew Israelites shouting all manner of abusive speech and propagating their views. I've got to develop an apologetic for that kind of religious, Black nationalist, racist kind of perspective that can feel so attractive to people who are hurt and embittered about their racial experience. That's not something that folks in most of the multi-ethnic contexts that I've been in think is really that important or big an issue, but it's massive in my community, right? So there are apologetic issues from which we need biblical resources and responses that actually don't get any play in multi-ethnic contexts. And so being in ethnic specific context actually enable us to do that work more effectively. So those would be three things that I would say, hey, just more effective evangelism of our neighborhood, more effective apologetic resources and responses for our context, and more effective leadership development and identification in our context that are better abled by a ethnic specific experience than they are oftentimes in a multi-ethnic situation.
Now, isn't it interesting as you're sharing that all churches seem to do that already, right? We have ministries for business people, right? Because there's a special, we can bypass some of the things that non-business people wouldn't understand. There's ministry for athletes in all levels, in churches and in universities and whatnot. We've got ministries for moms that stay at home. I mean, we recognize this, chaplains in the military, et cetera, because there's already an assumed position socially that they're dealing with. And so for people who, might critique why we have ethnic specific ministries, I'm pretty sure we have all these other ministries within our churches that we would recognize and support and pray for and fund. But when it comes to ethnic specific ministries, we don't, because I think we haven't thought about it in those ways. And you give some great examples, but why not? And I think the other part of this would be when people say, well, we all need to be one, and they don't like the specific ministries. And, when my white brothers and sisters might say that to me as a critique, I said, great, when are you going to come to my church? Exactly. You are welcome to come. We're sharing the gospel every Sunday. We preach Christ. You're welcome to come. But when you say, let's become one, you mean from your perspective, let's sprinkle in Black, brown, Asian into this mix, rich and poor. I want to do the same thing, but that's just not the lens you're coming from, right? Because that's multi-ethnic too. And we're not just Koreans at our church, but I would still recognize us as being a predominantly Korean church.
Amen. That's so good, brother. That's so good, brother. And this is why the multi-ethnic spaces, from what we can tell from some of the more recent research, is more effective at assimilating people to whiteness and sort of white cultural standards than it is at creating a really rich, pluralistic, multi-ethnic, cultural, political, name your sort of diversity category space where those things are welcomed and engaged in a healthy way.
Yeah. And you alluded to this earlier, but we're not a monolithic group. So we've got, in a predominantly Korean space, we've got class issues, right? And we've got political differences. There's a lot of white supremacy ideology that is embedded and embodied in Korean American people. Right. So it's not that we all think alike. And some people don't even like kimchi. That's really, if there was a sin, but that's a different story for a different time. We're not monolithic. So you have that kind of diversity even within a Korean ethnic specific church. And that's the Black church.
That's exactly right. We were just talking last night. We're about to launch some Beta Bridge groups in our church. Tasha Morrison's wonderful ministry, Reconciliation. Now, we're in a community that's 94% African-American last time I checked. We're a congregation that's probably, we would identify ourselves as predominantly Black. But within that, we've got Caribbean immigrants, first and second generations. We've got African folks who have immigrated to the country, first, second generation. We've got Black folk who come from the neighborhood, largely poor neighborhood. We got Black folk who are sort of Southern and middle class in their sensibilities, and one or two affluent folk. So you got class, you got culture, all that diversity beneath the sort of general label of Black, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And we still have to learn how to deal with that, to process that stuff biblically and graciously and winsomely toward unity. And so, I think you're absolutely right. To say that we're Black, brown, or yellow, or what have you, is not to say that we're just one thing and we all think alike.
It's too superficial of a level, especially if we're talking multi-ethnic spaces. That's about as deep as you can go. When you start getting into Afro-Caribbean experiences being fundamentally different from fourth generation Black Americans, African Americans, and your history, right? That's just too deep of a level. You can only go there when you're already sort of a critical mass.
That's right.
Groups. This is true for Asian Americans and immigration patterns, and language and culture and those types of things. So there are benefits and challenges, but certainly this is an area that we can explore deeper in our groups. Yeah.
Amen.
Man, I just want to be a fly on the wall and listen to you guys just talk. This is awesome. Thank you. Moving just to get the ball rolling, just the next question for both of you guys. How are ethnic specific churches any different from an all-white church then? Or is there even a difference? And isn't there a danger that ethnic specific ministries become ethnocentric ministry? How would you guys respond to those objections?
Please, brother.
I would say absolutely. Anytime you're in dominant spaces, you have blind spots and you're not able to see what's dominant. It's not just ethnic specific, or in my church, a Korean dominant ideology, but it's also Southern California. And it's also class. You're an extremely upper middle class type of church. We're Presbyterians after all. So, that's part of the challenge that we need to recognize, but at least we can recognize it and we should be able to address it, right? The danger, I think, with a white church is the normativity. That they would assume that being white and being American and being Christian is all the same, and it's conflated. For Korean Americans, we know we are not seen as Americans. And so that then informs some of our eschatological assumptions, that we know that this world is not our home, both spiritually and physically, right? But it is something that within groups we need to address, that we recognize, because we know what it feels like. But I think another distinction that I've recognized in some Korean American churches, I have to be a little bit more specific with my own experiences, is we struggle with our own internalized oppression. That even while you're attending an ethnic specific church, you don't feel like you can share and invite people into your church. And I've heard that when people say, Elder Alex, I want to bring my neighbor or my coworker, but we're a Korean church. And I said, but we're sharing the gospel, aren't we? We're not watching K-dramas on Sundays. We're sharing the gospel. But I realize what's embedded in that is this internalization that even as you attend one of these churches, you don't feel comfortable in that space, and you can't invite Black, brown, white, non-Christians into this space. But that's more a you problem. I think we need to address that. But I don't find white brothers and sisters do that. When they invite a non-white person to their church, you celebrate it. You're like, look, more diversity. But for whatever reason, in an ethnic specific church or a Korean church in my context, We don't see that as diversity. We see that almost as we're ashamed. And so that's something that we need to address in our own groups.
Oh man, that's so good. That's so good. You should just keep going, brother. I yield my time to the.
No.
That's so good. Listen, I mean, even in this conversation, my guess is there'll be some people who listen into this conversation, maybe who are coming from predominantly white churches, and their ears have been burning because they've heard terms like whiteness. They've heard terms like, dealing with white supremacy, white superiority, internalized oppression, and they don't really have categories for it other than to sort of. One of the unfortunate consequences of the civil rights movement, and it was not the intent of the civil rights movement, is that we've sort of stumbled into this place where we think the mention of whiteness, blackness, age, just the mere mention of it, much less the sort of separating into these groups, is exactly the same thing as what my brother was pointing out before, as the forced legalized segregation of the 50s and 60s. So I think many people have picked up this allergy to what we're talking about, and a further allergy to the kinds of things that we've been saying are actually pastorally necessary in spiritual formation. The discussion of the ways in which we internalize racism and internalize white supremacy and white superiority kinds of ideas. For example, I'll never forget having a conversation with a young African-American man and his pastor and a couple of other families who were just having dinner, and his pastor sort of looks at me and says, "Hey, talk to this guy for me." And I said, "About what?" He says, "This guy says that he will only marry a white woman because he wants his kids to be the little beautiful mixed kids that Black and white parents produce." Now, after I picked myself up off the floor, I asked him, "Is he joking you? I mean, what's going on right now?" And he says, "No, that's just what I want. That's what I want to do." So, okay. I said, "Are you even open to marrying a Black woman?" Said, "No, not really." And then he gave me all these stereotypes about Black women, right? And so I said, "Is your mama Black?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "You have any sisters?" "I got 2 sisters. Are your sisters Black?" "Yeah." "Are they women worthy to be loved? And are they, women worthy to be sought after?" And he kind of paused. He saw the trap, the noose tightening around his neck a little bit. But that's an example of the kind of internalized racism that's happening. This is why you go into multi-ethnic churches. And I don't want to be misunderstood, because I think inter sort of racial marriages model the gospel in really profound and beautiful ways. So this is not an argument against that. But if what you've internalized is Black women are undesirable in, any number of ways, and I should be seeking after a white woman, or you're fetishizing Asian women, for example, that's racism, and that's an internalized racism. That's the kind of stuff that needs to be exhumed and examined and expunged if we're going to be healthy people.
That's right.
And that's the kind of stuff, again, that just does not happen in multi-ethnic settings, because the call to unity there is often superficial. And the pushback against the conversations we're having are often pretty aggressive. Now, that's a long-winded way to getting to the answer of your question. Is there a possibility that ethnic-specific churches become basically like white churches in sort of different skin tones? Well, that's always a possibility, right? So the short answer to that is yes. A more interesting question to me is, what's the likelihood of that? Again, I think the likelihood is less likely, because, as my brother was pointing out a moment ago, we don't enjoy the majority status here. We don't have that kind of cultural power to make our own sort of ethnic experiences normative. The moment we leave our churches, we begin to engage the broader white culture, right? In fact, inside of our churches, and this is a challenge with multi-ethnic spaces, for example, inside of our churches, even if we're predominantly Black and brown, notice what happens without intentionality. You begin to bend, for example, in the worship style towards CCM. Yeah. You begin to bend toward contemporary you bend toward the Gettys, you bend toward, all great stuff.
All great stuff.
All great stuff. But where's the stuff that is reflecting the culture of the neighborhood that you're in and the people that you're in? If you're in a Hispanic culture, where are those Hispanic influences on music, right? Latin influences on music, Asian, African-American, gospel, those kinds of things. So I actually think the likelihood is significantly lower, even though the possibility is there, yes. And as my brother said a moment ago, the fact that we have been sensitized to what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that alienation, right, makes us sensitive to including and working against the tendency toward marginalizing others, because we know it's wrong and we have suffered it. And we have been fighting for a more egalitarian, a more inclusive society for all of our sojourn here. So I'd bet my money on ethnic specific churches being more hospitable than I would the idea that they're going to become just like white churches, and sort of repeat the problem in the opposite direction in that way.
I would add that, again, for a Korean American church leader in my spaces, we're ready for what Keller is talking about. He's talking about how idolatry is it's a good thing that becomes an ultimate thing. And so in that space where you're comfortable with other Asian Americans and ethnic specific ministries, we've got baggage on both sides, right? It's the twofold baggage. Like, we see the Korean church or the Chinese church and the immigrant church, and we're like, oh, that's my parents. I have lots of issues with that. And we make the mistake of throwing out what was good, what was spiritual, because it was tied to some of these cultural baggages of an immigrant family. And then we've got issues because of white supremacy and racism that some of us have suffered in the world outside of the church and sometimes in the church. So we celebrate that space and we welcome it, but then we take it too far, right? And so we've got to recognize as leaders where we're actually pushing that, to say, if you're too comfortable, we need to challenge you. And if you've been too challenged, then we need to comfort you. But it's always looking for that. And it's there. It's there because Satan would love to see this dismantled and the witness of an ethnic-specific church become ethnocentric.
That's right.
It is, and the priority and the order is reversed, that we're more ethnically identifying than we are as children of God. And so the leaders need to be guarding against that. And we're aware of it. But who's more aware of it than people who are in that space?
Well said.
Yeah. But Alex, I guess in response to what you shared a little bit, what's the definition of a multi-ethnic church, or what makes a church transition from ethnic specific to multi-ethnic?
Yeah, somebody came up with this idea, right? That it's 20% of the church is a non-dominant group. I've said that myself, right? But it's interesting because that applies perhaps what was predominantly a white church that sprinkled in black, brown, and yellow. But my church, as I look at it, it's a Korean church, but we've got Pan-Asian. And we also have white brothers and sisters. We have a small number of Black, Latinx. It's by that standard, right? We're coming close to a multi-ethnic church. And I'm pretty sure anyone who looks at our church would say, no, it's a Korean church. So it's I think it's a bias that we need to recognize implicitly of when we talk about 80%, 20%, right? We got to talk about who the 80% is.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Yeah,
that's good. It's almost a definition that centers whiteness again, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It centers the white majority experience as a sort of main experience. And then how many sprinkles can we put on that cupcake, right, to give it a slightly different appearance? And yet, if you ask yourself the question, well, what does multi-ethnicity look like in the Bible? I think you have to arrive at some really different metrics that have to do with the one another's and other things in the text that have to be ought to be plentifully there across that division. And if you look at someone like the Apostle Paul, who traveled and served with these sort of multi-ethnic mission teams, and you say, well, what's the secret to Paul's success? I mean, read, for example, Colossians 4, the sort of final greetings and salutations in Colossians 4. Note the diversity of persons that he mentions there. And he says, hey, I only got 2 or 3 people who are Jewish with me. Everybody else has forsaken me. Greet these folks. They're Colossians like you. These folks from over here. You got Onesimus there and slave. Paul seems to me to sort of diversify the center by bringing in the margins, right? So he goes out and he grabs folks on the margins, brings them to the middle, and that's how he diversifies the church. Mm-hmm. We seem to think that you can arrive at a diverse church by just actually noting a few people on the margins and putting them on your sort of publicity material. That's not how that works, not biblically. Biblically, there's got to be a kind of sharing in the church such that this question, this implicit question or notion of ownership, who owns the church, who's in the middle of the church, that gets kind of exploded in a sort of a New Testament biblical understanding of the church. And yet we leave it intact and then sort of build around it. And so, we've got radical work to do, even in multi-ethnic context, in reconceptualizing what it means to be multi-ethnic in that way.
It's so good.
Wow. Just final question then to wrap it up a little bit. Well, if someone is attending an ethnic-specific church, should that person feel guilty at all for not attending a multi-ethnic church?
No. No, I don't think so. No. I think that person should praise God. There is a church there.
Yeah.
Right. The miracle is dead people have been brought to life through the preaching of the gospel, adopted into the family of God, assembled there as a visible representation of God's people, of his kingdom in the earth. And the witness of the gospel is being held forth there in that community. That's a miracle. We take it for granted, but that's a miracle. Somebody spoke to dead bones and the bones rose up in life. That's right? Rejoice in that. The only question is, are we in a healthy ethnic specific church? Right. And so be there and work for biblical health. Be there and work for biblical zeal in mission and evangelism and disciple making and neighbor love. Be there and push for not just a doctrinal understanding of what it means to be a church, but be there and push for an ethical understanding of what it means to be the church. I mean, to be in the faith is not simply to believe the right things. It is to be in the faith. It is to be in a way of living together as a people. And that's getting short shrift. And that's not sort of accomplished just by being over here across town at a church, driving through 3 or 4 or 5 neighborhoods that need gospel witness, just so somebody over there can say their church is diverse. That's not a win for Team Jesus.
That's good. That's good. I think the listening audience might think, oh, when you say ethnic specific, we're talking about Black, brown, and Asian, right? But white churches also, right? You have to apply this to say you have ethnicity and culture. That's right. There's stuff that white brothers and sisters like that I don't. That's okay. So if you're in that space, I mean, I wrote about this in one of my books, this concept of white 22, right? You're white if you do, you're white if you do, and you're white if you don't. It's off of Joseph Heller's Catch-22. And so if we're a white church, then it's white supremacist. Not always. No, don't say that. But then if I'm trying to do a multi-ethnic church and all this criticism that I've heard, then I'm still being racist. So I can't win, right? But I think there's grace. And grace has to be a part of this as we think about your spaces and the gospel is being preached. And so, no, you shouldn't feel bad because your church is all white. If your community is all white, I mean, there are deeper sociological issues and legal issues, sort of precedent that may have created these communities. But if your church is that way, I mean, I don't think it helps to leave simply to go to a multi-ethnic church because simply because you want to be in multi-ethnic spaces, as we've just talked about, because they've got their problems too. Mm-hmm. But you're welcome to come to a Korean church. We'll post the address on the bottom. In the world we're living in, you can just go online. If you're at a church right now, that's fine. Please stay with your local church. But anyway, yeah. So we have to be able to be gracious to one another and not live in guilt or shame with where we are. But we can all change and we can all grow. In a Korean specific church, we should not simply be satisfied with where we are, because are we reaching our community? Are we being intentional and sharing the gospel with everybody that we can?
That's so good. Can I borrow a white 22, brother?
Yeah, of course you can.
That's so good. That's so good.
Oh man, thank you guys both for just sharing such pastoral wisdom through such a sticky and often controversial topic. This is such a helpful conversation. I hope our listeners were also as blessed as I was today. So thank you again for your time, and I hope we can do this again.
Amen. I love to. Thank you guys so much. Blessings on you, brothers.